Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today to discuss the topic, what's the big deal with a little security? I have a few housekeeping items to take care of first. First, please keep yourself muted. You can feel free to ask questions. There's a Q&A tab down at the bottom of your Zoom window where you can type questions, and you can also see other people's questions they've typed and upvote those that you find most relevant or interesting to make sure that the panel gets a chance to discuss. There will be a video recording of this event available on the website ncpc.gov following this event, probably tomorrow. And if you have any issues during the event or need technical support, please feel free to reach out to Melissa at NCPC. Her email address is in the chat, so you can find it there. I want to start the program by taking a moment to acknowledge that today is the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's death. His murder, of course, catalyzed activism and a national reckoning with the role of policing and community safety. His life mattered. So if you could join me in just a moment of silence to send love and light to his family and to steel ourselves for the work towards racial justice that is still ahead. Thank you all. So really excited to have you all here for a really important and timely discussion today. Of course, this event follows on a symposium that the National Capital Planning Commission hosted in September of 2019, so approximately 45 years ago by my calendar. And since that symposium in September of 2019, a lot has happened, right? We've had a global pandemic, a concomitant recession. That pandemic has highlighted and heightened the need for public space and also the intensity of demands on public space in our cities. And specifically in DC, we've seen the events from January 6th at the Capitol and all of the things that have followed at the Capitol complex. We have new opportunities with a new administration in DC. And so really excited to be here with you all today. We have a great group of experts and scholars here to discuss this topic. But before we get started, I want to introduce the hosts of the event, Marcel Acosta, Executive Director of NCPC, and Andrew Trueblood with the Office of Planning in DC.
Well, thanks so much, Jess. The National Capital Planning Commission has a long history of working with federal and district agencies to thoughtfully balance security and access to our public spaces. The 1995 Oklahoma City bombing and 9/11 instigated a wave of security measures at federal buildings and their subsequent expansion into our public spaces. As Jess mentioned, revisiting the security and public access issue is especially relevant since much has changed since our September 2019 public panel discussion on this very same topic. As she mentioned, the pandemic has reinforced the importance of open spaces and their benefits to our public health and economic viability. And our city recently faced new challenges in balancing security needs given the civil disturbances, such as the recent event at the US Capitol. These security measures sometimes result in the erosion of and restrictions placed on parks, sidewalks, and streets that have impacted our daily lives. In our nation's capital, we recognize that many spaces are symbolically important, but they are symbolically important because people could see it, experience it, and most importantly, know that it is open and accessible to all. We often immediately react to a threat by doing what we think is necessary. For instance, putting up security fences and closing off streets. But it is crucial that we now step back and ask questions about how we promote balance between security and public access under these changing threats. After our 2019 public panel, we proposed 10 big ideas for rethinking security in public space, and you'll see it on the screen. And also you can visit our website for further information. This is really an attempt to capture this balance, and we would like to continue to refine them into policy changes. So today, let's use this panel discussion as a moment to reflect and ask some very important questions about finding this right balance in order to maintain a safe, beautiful, and publicly accessible city. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Andrew Trueblood, the Planning Director of the DC Office of Planning. Andrew.
Thank you, Marcel and NCPC team for co-hosting this event with the DC Office of Planning around such an important topic. And thanks to our wonderful slate of panelists. I don't think it's a surprise that we had over 200 people sign up for this panel today. While OP and NCPC have been doing public space work for years, as you both have shared, I do think the last year has brought the value and challenges around our public realm into the forefront. We saw the reallocation and use of the public realm for COVID-related uses of parks and streeteries. And as we reflect on the day a year ago that George Floyd was murdered, we see how the public realm has become a place for racial justice protests. In DC, that's manifested itself in the core of the city through the Black Lives Matter mural and the more permanent Black Lives Matter plaza. And finally, as National Guard troops only recently in the last few days demobilized from the US Capitol, we can reflect on the lockdown of numerous city blocks around the US Capitol after the January 6th insurrection. In each of these, we have seen the opportunities and challenges of our shared spaces. But one thing that's clear to me is that the public realm is really what makes cities, and especially the District of Columbia, unique and special. It brings people together for recreation, discussion, and discourse. It can be a place to surface and celebrate culture, especially for those that have traditionally been marginalized. But for that reason, the public realm also can be a place that's used by bad actors. And the district realizes the need for security in public spaces, not only to protect the general public, but also with a special focus on certain areas, certain places like government agencies, government sites, and institutions. OP has been pleased to work with NCPC to advocate for security measures that are designed to be effective rather than just theater, which can sometimes happen, as well as compatible with the character of the district's wonderful public spaces. You can see here an image of public space outside the Department of Commerce headquarters, which was designed to be compatible with the district's streetlights, includes benches and attractive landscaping, as well as low impact development collecting stormwater from the street. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about our neighborhoods. I'd like to say that OP, through planning, engagement, and coordination with local and federal partners, has worked to promote thriving public spaces that offer a range of things to do that are accessible to everybody, and that provide social opportunities for connecting while also being safe and comfortable. While safety and fear factors are real in public spaces, the methods to counter them do not necessarily have to result in sterile and isolating places. The district has worked with a range of partners, from small, informal neighborhood groups to business improvement districts and the federal government, to champion innovative, people-centric, equity-driven public space activation and programming in all of the district's 8 wards. As we plan for the COVID recovery, we will look at ways that we can continue to invest in and leverage the value of our shared spaces to attract workers, residents, and visitors back to the district and back to our downtown. I'm looking forward to today's discussion and hearing how security can be incorporated to the district's public spaces in a way that achieves multiple federal and district goals related to security and vibrance. So thank you again. I look forward to hearing the discussion.
Great. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Marcel. And I realized I neglected to introduce myself before. I'm Jess Zimbabwe with Environmental Works Community Design Center, now based in Seattle, but formerly of DC. It's my pleasure next to introduce our 3 panelists for the day, and I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then each of them have a couple minutes of remarks sort of framing how they approach this issue, their mantra, what their focus is in this kind of work. So first, I'd love to introduce Commander Robert Glover. Commander Glover currently heads the Special Operations Division, where he manages all special operations units. In that role, he oversees several teams and units, including the Emergency Response Team, the Explosive Ordnance Disposal Unit, Harbor Patrol, Canine Unit, Domestic Security Operations Unit, Motor Carrier Unit, Harbor Patrol Unit, Air Support Unit, Horse Mounted Unit, a Planning Unit, Special Events Unit. So obviously he's thinking about these things day in, day out, working to protect our public spaces. So Commander Glover, I'd love to hear from you. Some opening remarks.
Good morning, and thank you for that humbling introduction to the participants and host, and we appreciate being invited to participate today on behalf of Chief Robert J. Conti and our men and women of the police department. As we've experienced the last year, it has really put a lot of stress on public safety, not to include not only the Metropolitan Police Department, but the District of Columbia Fire and Emergency Medical Services, Department of Public Works, District Department of Transportation, Department of Health, Department of Consumer Regulatory Affairs, ABRA, which is our alcohol licensing board. So when we moved from COVID to the civil unrest spurred by the unfortunate and tragic death of Mr. Floyd last year today, it has really brought to bear the importance of security in new areas. We saw, I hate to use the term run on grocery stores at the front part of COVID, so we had to adapt the response plan for our community grocery stores. We saw an increase last year during the Cherry Blossom Festival, how the pandemic restrictions brought up a concern of a super spreader event, and then the unrest kind of unfortunately speaks for itself, which presented challenges, especially after January 6th. But I look forward to being a participant in this panel, and I again appreciate the humble introduction and the opportunity to offer some comments.
Thank you. And next, I'd like to introduce Juliette Kayyem with the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And Juliette has spent over 20 years managing complex policy initiatives and organizing government responses to major crises in the state and the federal government, in state and federal governments. She's a national leader in homeland security, resiliency, and safety, and currently is the senior Belfer lecturer in international security at Harvard at the Kennedy School. She's the author and editor of numerous books, founder of Kayyem Solutions, and appears frequently on CNN and other media outlets, but is on CNN, their on-air national security analyst, and hosts a weekly show on Boston's NPR affiliate, WGBH. Yeah. Juliette.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for organizing this. In some ways, the timing is so perfect, and I'll put my wonky Kennedy School slides up for the audience. Not simply for the year anniversary and what George Floyd's killing represented for so many cities and continues to represent for so many communities, hopefully all communities. But also we are 24 hours after the National Guard ended its deployment in the District of Columbia, a deployment that surged after January 6th and included a multi-state emergency effort to bring more physical presence. You can call it security theater. I don't think it is, but it was just a way to stabilize an area of the city. So in some ways, I look at this like maybe this is a good time to also begin a conversation about the future. I guess the third thing is that the White House announced we're at 50% of adults having been fully vaccinated. So we are in some ways in a sort of post-disaster, I don't know if that's the fairest way to put it, stage. So in the next slide, I'll sort of explain how I think about it. So I don't think about security. Sometimes people think about security as one thing, a wall, a lock on the cockpit door, a fence or whatever. Sometimes people think of it as binary, right? It's a freedom or security, as if they're mutually exclusive. And one way I think about it, because I do plan help plan a lot of mega event planning, sporting events, and other efforts like that, is to really think of it as a three points to a triangle. And I'll be very quick here, but what you want to do is you want to enhance security, but also secure flow, right? Those two things have to be compatible. And the more security that you have, the less flow that you can have. Flow meaning just the movement of people or goods or ideas or fun, the flow of fun. We all deserve that now. So the way to think about it is, or the way I think about it is, you want to minimize all risk. And I'm quite clear here that I don't focus on a certain thing. It's not the terrorist or the insurrectionist or climate change only or cyber only. We really have to think about security mechanisms that cover as many hazards as possible, or a pandemic. So you want to minimize those to the extent possible, right? Because then if you can minimize their impact, then you have less to have to manage. The second part to think about is you want to maximize unified defenses. And I think this is really important for DC, both because you have such a funky governance structure. Funky is a nice way to put it, but you have local assets, federal assets, community assets, but it's not just thinking about it as public safety or emergency management. There are community efforts out there as well to help support or maximize unified defenses. So I really do think that our security can be made better the more we engage others, that we don't view it as the exclusive province of, oh, the police officers or whoever else. The third is you want to maintain the social fabric. That's why we're here, right? I mean, the more, as I said, the more I know how to make, because I was the state Homeland Security advisor in Massachusetts, I know how to make the Boston Marathon perfectly safe, right? The only answer is I don't have the marathon, right? So you're really thinking about risk reduction. Safer is how we think about it, because you want to maintain the social fabric. You want to maintain who you are as DC, which is not simply the capital. It's where people live, it's where they congregate, it's where they raise their children. So thinking about it this way may help. It's just sort of a framework that I go through when I start to think about tactical planning, right? Because as I said, too much security is going to bump up against maintaining who we are as a society. Okay, next slide quickly. This one's easy. So one of the things I think about, and I'm sure others who are on the operational side will do this, is just sort of where do you want to put your resources? So once again, maybe a little wonky, but just helpful to think for people to know how people like me and police departments and others think about it, which is there's only so much you can put on prevention, only so many gates, fences, whatever, until, as I said, you stop being who you are. And so then, so we call that left of boom, whether it's prevention or protection. And then you think about right of boom, which is what, God forbid, if something happened, how do I minimize the consequences of it? Remember, we are dealing with vibrant urban places that are awesome. It is why we live in cities. I live in a city. They are great fun. They come with vulnerabilities and risks. And so our goal isn't to talk in terms of risk elimination. It is how do we best minimize the risk. And part of that is to invest in the response, recovery, and resiliency efforts that make us stronger, even and better, even if the bad thing were to happen. It's a hard way to talk, but I think we're inevitably at that stage. And we are, and honestly, we are that way with the pandemic, that we're not at the risk elimination stage. We're coming out with still the potential for pockets of infection, but we've all accepted, and I think rightfully so, that that we need to maintain the social fabric, which is including getting out and about. So a couple ways to think about it as we go along with the questions as well. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Juliette. And I'd love to introduce our third and final panelist, Susan Piedmont-Palladino. And Susan is an architect and an educator and director of Virginia Tech's Washington-Alexandria Architecture Center. She's also a consulting curator at the National Building Museum. She's the author of several books and was awarded the inaugural Vision and Design Award from the Branch Museum of Architecture and the Washington Architecture Foundation's John Wiebenson Award for work dedicated to public interest. Susan.
Jess, and thank you, NCPC and everybody. It's a great panel to be on and absolutely fascinating. I was reading the Post this morning and seeing this beautiful piece by Eugene Robinson about Black Lives Matter Plaza, and thought maybe Eugene Robinson should be here instead of me because he could talk about that, but I encourage everyone to read it. I want to get back to Juliette's statement about the funky governmental structure of the district. As an architect and an urbanist, but mostly an educator, a design educator, I talk to my students about Washington as two cities right on top of each other. Yeah. And it's stitched together. Yeah. Is the way you're quilting. It's stitched together at public spaces and squares and circles, and then this big piece in the middle. And so there's really no city quite like Washington, and a source of sort of endless fascination. And a lot of my interest in research is in how the First Amendment is literally embodied in our city plan, and how those are spatial rights. That is, they literally take place. And so working our way down from public policy to planning all the way to design, it falls to design to shape the elements and the fabric and the places where people actually encounter with their bodies. And so I want to go back to the third week of January, which was my spring semester started, Inauguration Day, Martin Luther King Memorial Day. It was a week that I just would describe as full of commemoration, chaos, and hope. And I got a call from a reporter asking if I wanted to give any comments about the barriers and the fences that had gone up around the city. And I always say yes to these things because the same reason I say yes to this, I like talking about these issues. But I really wrestled with what tone to strike and wanted to make sure I didn't sound like a sort of a formalist who's interested in the aesthetic implications of this, because those are important, but they aren't actually the primary issue. And so I wanted to say something memorable. I figured I was only going to have a few minutes with him. And I said, you know, we've gotten some beautiful improvements to the city because of fear. And the minute that came out of my mouth, I thought, oh, I'm not so sure. I really wish I'd said that. Indeed, that's of course what was quoted in the article, that we've gotten some beautiful improvements to the city out of fear. And the idea that we can make something beautiful from fear is something we really have to wrestle with. And to me, that's an interesting part of this discussion. So I see this as we're sort of presented with some really interesting dilemmas. And in the sense that our buildings and landscapes are constantly communicating to us. Like we're moving around the city and everything is signaling to us, telegraphing, welcome, stay away, telling us what behaviors are appropriate, access. And these signals are literally emitted by designed elements. So closed gates, high fences, blank walls, Jersey barriers say, you don't belong here, you need papers, request permission, you're not safe here, go away. Whereas open lawns, chairs, movable tables and chairs, steps to sit on, shaded streets, these say, you're valued, you're welcome, stay here. And so somewhere between intention and interpretation is, of course, where meaning gets constructed. And to me, it's sounding like a complete academic. That's where I think this discussion is really interesting today. So that's where I'm coming from.
Great. That's great. And I have a few questions I'd like to ask the panelists together, but then we will be taking questions from the audience. So everyone that's watching at home or their office, make sure to use that Q&A button down at the bottom and post your questions there. I would like to just start on the fencing that happened around the Capitol complex after the events of January 6th. Let's start there. People tend to react to, and the reason the reporter called you is because people are thinking about the most recent event, right? The thing that's very current. So is there something about the fencing of the Capitol complex that could be done differently to have less, negative impact or response? And then how do we also think about those immediate term impacts versus the medium term and the long term impacts of a move like fencing off the Capitol complex?
Well, I guess I'll jump in and speak first. I mean, there's the issue of the temporariness of fencing and Jersey barriers. On the one hand, the temporariness provides a kind of reassurance that maybe this isn't a permanent fear. And so I go back and forth by thinking that really the temporary is the solution, and that just like when the National Guard walks away and when the fences come down, that's a cause for real celebration. On the other hand, again, we can get beautiful things out of fear. But to look at what the fences, what's the impact of that? I think of that as a parallel to when you walk through a neighborhood and you see bars on the windows. It's kind of what I think of as a iatrogenic solution, in that it can inadvertently cause the problem it's trying to solve. So when you walk through a neighborhood and you see bars on the windows, you begin to feel, maybe this isn't a safe place to be. All the people who live here don't seem to think it is. Maybe I shouldn't be here. Streets become deserted. We end up with actually reifying the very problem that was supposed to be solved. Whereas if you walk down a street where none of the windows are barred, you think this is a street of people that are happy to communicate with the outside world. And I feel like the fences are barred windows writ large. And so that shift from whether we're moving into permanent solutions, and maybe we'll talk about design possibilities. I mean, we certainly have the grounds of the Washington Monument. We have the pedestrianization of Pennsylvania Avenue. I'm happy to talk about those in more detail. But to me, the impact of what that's saying to people right now is really worrisome.
I mean, I think I'll just add, I'm really pleased that they're removed, but I don't criticize as Susan, consistent with Susan, the use of them at the beginning. I mean, for one, we didn't know what the threat environment was like after January 6th. We should have known, but that's a longer story. So you don't know if there's waves, you don't know essentially. And then remember, between the 6th and the 20th, you have the inauguration. So that seemed right. The challenge that any city in reacting, like in other words, this is how we're going to be, is what we call the ratchet up conundrum. It is so easy to put more security on and almost impossible to take it off. I mean, most people, any experience at an airport might wonder how much of this is actually necessary anymore. The last, just to give you a sense of how hard it is politically, the last National Guard member to be to exit or to stop guarding a state's nuclear facility after 9/11, which may have been an appropriate immediate response, was 7 years later, because no governor wanted to say, we're fine, even though no one in the space thought, oh, come on, these guys are not going after nuclear facilities, it's too hard. So I really do commend it. And now it is, okay, so some ways you think of it like we are in that post-boom period where we have the ability, or we're in the recovery period, excuse me, where we have the ability to envision. And then we have to base that on what's the threat. So I think January 6th was unique. One hopes. It may have to ratchet up at the next election, depending on where people's, what is happening with a real challenge to democracy. I'll be blunt here, and whether people seem willing to take up arms in their perverse notion of what's going on. So you may want to have a system that ratchets up every 2 years or whatever in light of elections. And then the biggest threat would seem to me to be vehicular, which can be fixed through beautiful architecture, through plantings and others, so that people can be pedestrians and you're protecting them from what is now a pretty praised approach by the threat out there, which is the use of vehicles. So that's how I would think about it. We really are in this interesting phase where we can redesign. We can always ratchet up close to an election or close to whenever there might be some event, but always have some sunset provision that lets you ratchet back down without anyone having to make a political call. You just say, okay, we're going to do this for 2 weeks.
Right. Interesting.
And the perspectives given are truly amazing. And this is where interlocking disciplines come to bear. We deal with the all hazards prevention on the front end, and then should that boom happen in that cycle, that linear cycle, then we're responding to that. I go back to the wonderful statement, we get beautiful things out of fear. You look at the Holocaust Museum. When the Holocaust Museum was designed and built, it was probably one of the most prominent features of security through design in the district that comes to mind. And tragically, we had the Holocaust incident. And through that design, that prevented a greater loss of life. Prior to Oklahoma City, we had the Hoover Building was designed with the intention of vehicle-borne threat, the way that was constructed and designed to withstand that blast and account for those countermeasures. But we go back to General Lafon and the design of the city in and of itself, and we know that his thought of creating the traffic circles and things like that was to confuse an invading army. Unfortunately, that did not work out too well for us back in the 1800s. But it does, when you look at that, it does assist us in facilitating peaceful First Amendment assemblies and activities. When we want to have them here, and that's their constitutional right, we support that 100%, but it allows us to facilitate that with ease because we're on a grid system. A lot of cities don't have the grid system. So we're able to box out the traffic, still keep the public going and walking, but keeping them safe to prevent that unwanted vehicle intrusion, even by accident. So I think we've got a really good mix here in the city. I think everybody's responsible in their approach. It's through hard work and collaboration, such as these seminars, where the shared thought between the disciplines comes to bear, and really not losing sight of that all hazards. And for example, weather. So how do you protect people on the National Mall and on Independence Day? And I've been part of the evacuation when we've had a fast moving storm come in. That gets real messy real quick. So even, again, it's a beautiful thing that comes together. We don't hope for that boom, but we have to plan for it.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you all. The pandemic has highlighted in cities around the world, really, the importance of the assets of public space in cities, right? And how much we need public space if we're going to live as densely as we do in cities. And certainly DC is blessed with a rich patchwork of public space in really, national scale and down to the local scale, public spaces that are in the city. So how do we keep those public spaces open to the people? How do we keep potentially expanding them? What's the interplay there in public space?
I'll just quickly say, look, we learned as we went. So part of it is to view a pandemic like other, like Officer Glover was saying, in terms of, we do think about all hazards. So a pandemic is just providing health intelligence, no different than criminal intelligence, whatever. So we learned as we went along. So if I were to say, what's my baseline for the next pandemic, I only laugh because I'm like, can we please, let's just have a summer. But let's say that there's pockets in the fall or winter. Some people are suspecting, although DC's numbers look good, you have so many travelers and visitors. So there's two things I would think about. So one is closing public spaces is the last resort, not the first. And DC is no different than any others. We didn't know what was going on, so the parks were closed, things were locked up. The exact opposite this time. We now know, unless there's any proof that it's airborne in a way that that would keep us. An airborne thing would keep us all inside. So that would be the first. The second, and this is controversial, but as you think about private concerts and other things, I'm a big fan right now in the absence of and look, every security posture is going to be only so good as for 3 to 6 months. So I'm only talking about through the summer and the fall, but beginning to devise ways in which proof of vaccination provides a benefit to the public that doesn't to the rest of the public that either hasn't, and then we deal with the access issues, or won't get vaccinated. So you're starting to see that now, in particular private concerts. I just saw that Stephen Colbert is going to reopen up, but you have to have proof of vaccination. That's a different kind of open space. But I do think that we're gonna get into this sort of some of it will be about access. So think about colleges and universities. You can't actually enroll without it. But part of it is just to think about a burdens and benefits or carrots and sticks process. And this is where I think public space can actually, you want to kind of lure people to the fun side. I'm not into forced vaccination. You kind of want to say, look, we're having more fun over here, and we'd love for you to join us safely. And so thinking about ways in which we can promote that both from the public and private perspective. I'll say quickly, I got invited to a wedding in which I have to have a private wedding, but at a facility that is on a beach that is requiring vaccination proof. And I have never been happier to upload something. I was like, good for them.
I want to get back to your Juliette's comment about the irony that one of the first things that we did was to close public parks and playgrounds. And granted, we know now that that was maybe the exact opposite thing to do, but we were dealing with something that was completely unknown. And this issue of one way to look at public space or open space is that it's a finite resource. And to make more of it, you have to take it from somewhere else to make more of it. And so we're used to sort of objecting to privatization of public space. But if we think about publicization of private space, or, how do we actually make more public space? And those boundaries are constantly shifting. And so one of the examples that I think is fascinating, that's pandemic related, but also, in my view, adds to a healthier, livelier city, is this closing of streets. And the district has had all this slow streets. And as I walk around my neighborhood, people are moving into the street. There's some interesting flip sides to that, like the whole rise of the streeteries. So, and anyone who knows me will attest, anytime we remove private automobiles for the streets, I'm going to be the first one cheering for it. That giving back space to pedestrians and bicyclists and people and getting rid of all the big metal vehicles, I'm all for. And so that's fantastic. On the other hand, private businesses encroaching on a previously public sidewalk and a public space, and now saying to enjoy this new lively space, you need to be able to afford a cup of coffee, you need to be able to afford a sandwich to sit here. That should give us pause. So then here's where we back up to policy decisions. How do we actually make these streets for people and complete streets in a way that is economically viable for business and also good for the city, and begin to carve out reservations, in a sense, public spaces that are truly public, that we've managed to reclaim from traffic, and now we've got to make sure that they're, equitable. So that boundary between public and private is shifting, and I think what's the parallel between sort of public space and civic space? Well, the boundary between what's acceptable and where we can exercise First Amendment rights or sort of occupy space, that's also been shifting since 1894, when Jacob Coxey stepped on the grass and dared anyone to arrest him because you weren't supposed to step on the grass at the Capitol building. And we look back at that and that's so crazy. You weren't allowed to step on the grass. Well, we've seen that happening, but I think those are, to me, those are really interesting examples of understanding that if we're quarrying public space, in a sense, we're taking it from something else, and that we have to treat it as a really precious resource.
And, from the first responder community, and, as we move forward and find additional space out there in the public realm, is that the collaboration in advance, I think, is sometimes missed. And I'll give an example. We have new marble median strips being put in the city in an effort to manage traffic more effectively and reduce that risk, right? But when you raise that curb up such high, our fire department vehicles can't get across them. So again, that collaboration and that interlock between agencies is critical, and it cannot be missed. And, the streeteries, I was part of the Public Safety Committee on that. And as we moved into the street, obviously that vehicle intrusion became, whether accidental or intentional, became a huge issue for us. And how do we protect them? Again, so, from public safety standpoint, we kind of remain neutral in thought about how best to use the public space, but we need to be at the table to help plan how to secure that public space within reasonableness. So again, more features that are out there that may be hidden or through intentional design also reduces our demand for our services and can free us up for what we should be involved in.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to ask a question about, the threats in public space are always evolving, right? I think we've talked about how surprising some events were, whether they are more organized or disorganized or natural or man-made, human-made. So, and I know at the September 2019 forum, we talked a little bit about layering of security measures, partly to address that, the layering of, cameras with security guards, with barricades, other physical measures. How do you, first of all, what new threats do you think are on the horizon? And how did you design for a threat that you can't predict? And then what's the right balancing of that layering in planning for the unpredictable of threats?
I'll go first if the panel would like. I think with our department's IT breach and the pipeline breach, we can't forget about that cyber threat. So as we layer on things through technology, we have to be concerned about how do we protect that technology and infrastructure on that back end. So your first layer may get taken out through a hack or breach. But I was participant last Wednesday with the NFL security seminar, and Director Jim Murray for the United States Secret Service was one of the panelists. And Director Murray's very poignant is, if you look at the principle of protection, it's concentric rings. So by the time you get down to your core, you're kind of at your last stand. So the more we can do further out, I think the better prepared we all will be. And we have to account for those all hazards. We want to prevent that boom as far out as what we possibly can to the crowd or whoever's assembled or picnicking or riding their bike. But again, we have to look at it through those rings. That's a basic principle of protection. And I believe the Secret Service, I give them hats off to them. They're the best agency in the world that does that.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think there's a slow motion boom
Yeah.
that we situationally pay attention to. It's climate change. And I think that impact on this city, flooding, I was involved with a group with a small practice iStudio and my own students looking at the next century of the commemorative landscape and whether hardening and engineering our way out of that is the solution, or whether we actually have to look at an entirely different strategy. And I think that will affect our public space. That'll affect how we occupy public space. That'll affect, back to weather events, extreme heat. So the climate change, that time now I can never get out left of the boom, right of the boom diagram. So thanks for that. And that boom is like a low rumble that's just going on and on and on. And to me, that's one of the ones it's like, oh, well, we'll deal with that later. Someone else will deal with that later, because we always have an acute problem that we're trying to solve, and we're often solving it retrospectively. And I think that's why this is such a difficult question. And the decision-making of changing policy, implementing a plan, working through the public process, designing and then constructing, you have this long-term solution to a problem that by now has kind of passed. And I think that gets into this really difficult question about multi-pronged solutions and thinking about what the performance specs are. What are we really trying to accomplish here? So when we think about public space, it has to perform, and now I'm talking about Washington in particular, but anywhere, it has to perform environmentally, functionally, socially, and culturally. And all of those, every space in the city doesn't match up with each one on the top. But it seems to me that as we're thinking about these different threat assessments and climate change versus domestic terrorism versus external threats, figuring out sort of where that matches up with what we want out of that space is really key for the planning and design end of this.
When people ask me what's the biggest threat, there's only one existential threat facing this country now. The others are manageable, even if harmful, and that's climate change. It's just going to change everything from force readiness. So this is relevant to DC, the Pentagon, Navy facilities, armories, to the movement of people, and now even talking, really realistically about managed retreat, that cities and communities begin to ease a transition out of certain areas. One of the things that I just, and I think that's right. And there's tactical threats like cyber challenges and ideology or radicalization, but none is going to change the way we think about how we live in the next 20 or 30 years. I think one of the things that I just would add to this, obviously, first responders, when they train for response and recovery, they're pivoting all the time and thinking through, okay, at the moment that the bombs go off at the Boston Marathon, we don't know it's two brothers or if it's a media generator, right? Who cares, right? You just have the capacity to pivot and respond in real time. One of the things I worry about, though, especially a city like DC, where the presence of so many security assets make it easier to deploy them, is something that we call in my space, a security offset, or the wonky term is risk homeostasis, which is basically answering the question, how many people die who jump out of planes in parachutes today? Well, you would think fewer than 30 or 40 years ago, because we do things better and parachutes are better and brakes are better and our transparency is better. It's actually the same number. Why? Because the better the parachutes got, the more risky parachuters got. So you actually have, this offset. And so one of the things I worry about is the more people put on prevention, and we can stop the bad guys and build this, the less we're putting on how do we engage a community to best respond after something happens, right? We sort of think, and we need to begin to think about those appropriate offsets so that we're not just constantly jumping out of a plane each time. It's a little anecdote that I love, because it's like the human condition. If I feel safer, I'm gonna then be more aggressive. And if I don't feel safer, I'm on a street without a median line, actually there's fewer accidents on those streets, and because people are cautious.
Yeah, that's great. Those are all important thoughts on a difficult topic. I want to move to questions from the audience. We've got a few great ones in here. One that I think is really profound is about what are some practical ways that residents of DC and users of this public space in DC can advocate for sensible solutions like we're discussing, and as opposed to the security creep that seems to keep adding, right? We talked a little bit more about the fencing of the Capitol complex. I mean, that was important for the security of the complex, but it's also like a big piece of land in the middle of the city.
Yeah.
People commute across it on their bikes or with a stroller, and it can be very disruptive to people's lives. The new fence on the north side of Pennsylvania Avenue is complete, so Pennsylvania Avenue could be reopened, but it isn't. So there's and there's this complex, as you called it, funky but certainly complicated overlapping of different types of law enforcement. But what are some practical ways that you could push back on that creep in DC?
Oh, I guess I'm on the hot seat for this.
Yes.
Sorry.
The residents.
Understanding just civics, right? And it goes back to how the District of Columbia, it's still a federal district. It's the seat of government. It's constitutionally embedded. That's a tough nut to crack. But we do that through collaboration and partnerships and open discussions and frank dialogues. Chief Conti's done an amazing job, with the police reform movement coming across the country. He's doing listening sessions with our communities. And you really have to go to your community. You have to go to your stakeholders. You have to go to your residents and find out what they truly want. And in DC, we have 8 different wards. And with those 8 different wards, we probably have 300, 400 plus unique communities. And even within those communities, you can boil it down to complexes or streets that have historical meaning for the city. So I think it really starts at the grassroots, your residents. You have to get open forums and your listening sessions and feedback and surveying your communities to really what they want or need. And you have to have a needs-based approach, I think, on this one from the stakeholders. And that's your child that wants to go out and ride their bike safely in their neighborhood or utilize the park. So again, I think it starts in that community footprint.
And I'll do a sort of shout out for the agencies like NCPC and CFA and all of these agencies that really regulate what gets built and when and how. And these, there's hearings that are open to the public. There's much debate in sort of public process communities about the shift to online. Has this made it easier for people who can't get a babysitter or who can't travel to come to a public meeting and to participate? Or are we still assuming that everyone has Wi-Fi access? So there's equity and access issues there, but I think that attending and listening to conversations, if something's planned for your neighborhood, if you're in a ward or neighborhood that's being impacted by these decisions, then listen in and make your voices heard. And sometimes that might mean taking to the streets, right? I mean, this is the peaceably assemble to redress grievances. But then we do have such a proliferation of opportunities. That's why we call it the public process, is to sort of make these changes and get people to weigh in on them and share their concerns. And that's what certainly this event is about.
Just the public process, we've seen it work in the past. We just had the 10th anniversary of Joplin's recovery. Joplin's in Missouri, 120 people dead in 20 seconds from a tornado. And they took a very, very community, they knew they were segregated. They knew they were segregated by inequality. They wanted more bike paths. They wanted more public space, and used this tragedy as an opportunity. I guess I'd say also the second thing is just on the public, the government end, because of the governance structure at DC, to really be receptive to these voices who know better. And I one of the things that always amazes me, and I've been in government and out of government, or try to live by the motto one of my bosses told me, which is sometimes there's wisdom in the noise. I mean, in other words, when you're in government and you have complaining communities, your inclination is, I know better than them. And to try to find that wisdom in the noise, these communities know exactly what they want and what their priorities are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And I'd love to combine a question that I have with one that's come up in the audience too. And it's about sort of how do we maintain safety and also hold the values of equity, right, in public space. And, certainly there's been attention to racial profiling in policing, but there is racial profiling in everyday citizens too, right? And we've seen a national attention to that too, different ways that people use public space. And there are instances where in slow streets, people have been stopped saying like, you don't look like you live or belong on this street. What are you doing on my slow street? Or in public space, criticizing people for enjoying the public space differently. And then there's also a question in the audience that's, I think, a really important one about adverse impacts of the physical barriers, in particular on the disabled community, right? So additional Jersey barriers, just dropping new fences can create all kind of mobility blocks that make it even harder for people to use those public spaces if they have any mobility impairment. So how do we make sure that we're making spaces that are safe, but also actually equitable and for everybody? How do we hold that at the forefront in these discussions?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can. Go ahead, Robert.
Thank you, ma'am. It really goes back to your communities. You really have to listen to your communities. I know it becomes very difficult for folks to understand. The law enforcement's trying to back away in general to a lot of things that we've been involved in through the last couple decades that we probably should have never been involved in, and we're making that stride to move back from those. But I can't emphasize enough of the community. How do you keep it safe without being overbearing? And just a real life example is when we watch assemblies, you watch the crowd dynamics and you actually talk to the folks, right? So it's even listening to the people there assembled. The challenges for the district, it's unique. We are divided by two rivers as well. And it's commonly referred to east of the river and west of the river. And it's a big disparity. But Mayor Bowser has made a very strong commitment to supporting east of the river through building blocks and an all government approach to solving some of the long-term community issues there that have been created, unfortunately. So again, she's made wise investments in east of the river, new parks and rec centers, community pools, libraries. She just did the ribbon cutting in Southwest, the new library, which is a phenomenally looking building from the outside, and the inside's even better, right? So again, I think it really takes a whole scale government commitment from the executive down, and it has to be percolated down. Chief Conti's got an amazing statement: excellence is transferable. So that thought pattern has to be absorbed throughout the government. Everybody has to understand the importance of it, but that vision has to be shared.
Yeah, and I mean, it's kind of the flip side of the long discredited broken windows theory, that a broken window creates more broken windows. Well, a new branch library, a new park, a new rec center increases community care and pride, and then that changes how a community sees itself. And so get back to the role of design in answering this question, Jess. And not only, I mean, at the public space scale, I mentioned at the beginning, point at the improvement to the Washington Monument grounds by Laurie Olin, landscape architect, and also Michael von Valkenburg's original design for the pedestrianization of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Those are two, in my view, excellent public spaces designed for accessibility and security, beautifully designed and inevitably inspiring. I used to love to ride the shared red bikes down to Pennsylvania Avenue, and you would see roller hockey and you'd see people taking pictures. You'd see families from all over the world. Same with the Washington Monument grounds. And then in our local city, I'd add a project like the 11th Street Bridge Park, which worked really hard to make sure that all of these thoughts are in that design. And so it can be done, and it really is best done, like we've said earlier on, including a lot of different voices. But we have such great examples, not to mention, again, the new branch libraries and rec centers around the city. So there's real cause for optimism on that level.
Yeah.
And anybody have thoughts about how to, I mean, it's just so easy, the physical barriers, especially when they're deployed quickly or, in response to something, for them to just be deployed right in the middle of the curb cut, right, blocking the sidewalk. How do we make sure that we're not in making a place safer, making it just inaccessible for people?
Yeah. That shouldn't be allowed. And here's where technology, I mean, just simply put, and generally would not survive. Here's where technology does get excited in the same way that design can really help us live differently, live with secure flow, right? I mean, in other words, design helps that. It's the height of a planter tells you something. The way that we move is just really important. And for those of us who live in cities, it's just why we're there. We like that. We've missed the density. We might be overwhelmed by it right now. I just went out on a Friday night for my first Friday night. I was like, it's going to take a while, and then want to promote it. So this is also where really, so technology is going to help in terms of, we talk about community engagement. So there's a lot of apps that give community members ways to complain's the wrong word, is to, say something's not working for this part of the community, ways in which, because of health issues, touchless security is really becoming a big thing, whether it's through a crowd flow or biometric information. I know there's privacy concerns, but all of these things over time will make the experience of security, I think, better, not worse, even though we tend to be more worried about the surveillance state. I actually think in the end, it's going to make us freer and faster, which is what we want.
And I apologize. Of course, the good questions all start flowing in, and we have 4 minutes left in the program. So I don't know if they will stay up, or we can type answers to them and get back to folks, because there's a bunch of good questions. But one that maybe we could just do a quick round on is about sort of how do we balance in planning our cities. There is something that is the key to resilience that is about being nimble, right? So having like a process that's a long planned out, so that there's predictability in design and development, but also something that can be adaptable to change quickly in response to a pandemic, in response to a new situation. How do we make space for both of those? And I guess that relates to all of our planning and approvals and development and security processes, but how do we hold both of those together?
Yeah.
Well, anytime you call something a pilot project, then you're testing it. And I know that Gale Architects and New York and the sort of, let's just pretend we're going to close Times Square for a little while. Like, let's just do this for kicks. Let's see what happens. And then you gather data. I mean, I think the whole sort of pop-up tactical urbanism, and we're actually seeing that at play right now. If we have the patience and get enough people involved to actually get some actionable data on what's been working, what hasn't been working. Because doing something permanent, you're changing the environment, you're changing conditions, and you can have all sorts of unintended consequences. But I think the whole world of tactical urbanism has opened up that opportunity. Just reassure people, don't worry, it's just paint. Don't worry, it's just some movable picnic tables. And if it bothers you, we'll reassess next year. Like you said, let's call it, I think Juliette, so let's call it 2 weeks. Let's call it 2 months. And if there is a sunset, it's easier then to sort of say, let's now step back and see what worked and what didn't work. And I think if people are sort of on board with that as a method, then we can move ahead with bigger decisions, feeling more comfortable that we actually did gather some data.
That's a great suggestion. Excellent. Anything else? And so there are like half a dozen other extra questions. I apologize. I don't know what will happen to them, if we can answer them, or NCPC will, post it on their website.
Right. Okay, good.
I'm going to just say something like that will happen. But I do want to just thank all of our panelists for this engaging discussion. And to everyone who watched and sent in these excellent questions. You'll be able to watch a recording of this event on the ncpc.gov website. And please be on the lookout for more events and discussions. There's one that's posted in the chat. In particular, Congresswoman Norton is hosting a roundtable on the Capitol fencing alternatives on June 1st. So make sure that you follow that if that's a topic of interest to you, as per our discussion here. And yeah, so just make sure to follow NCPC for the recording here and find other events. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Robert.